Okay, that's a decent amount of material still to go over. Oh, we'll do our best. Oops, no. Stop that. Okay. Okay, how are we doing for time? All right, it's 2 o'clock. Let's get started. And then maybe we can finish and I'll chat a little bit about the midterm. My wires are tangled and I don't like it. So, okay, so here's my intention, if you will. Microphone on. My hope is that we get through the rest of quantitative sampling today. I think we got about 15, 16 slides to go. So if we can get through that, I'll talk a little bit about the midterm. The midterm is super straightforward. As I said before the recording started, for those who don't want to brave the cold and frost, I took structured observation out. I think it was on eClass until a minute ago. We're not going to talk about it. It's just a very particular method that fits like organizational communication and things like linguistics, but we're not really going to use it. And I've never seen a sociological study using structured observation. I'm sure they exist, but I don't want to talk about it because it's kind of dull. So we're going to finish up talking about sampling methods and then a little bit about the midterm. And if everything goes well and I get done today, Wednesday's class is not canceled, but instead of doing it here, we'll do it in my office and it'll be like drop in, midterm questions, major lab 1 questions and all of that stuff. And we'll take a break so that you have a little bit more study time and some time to work on some assignments. Okay, the other thing is you have here, and I know it's a quick turnaround, you have your labs tomorrow, right? And the labs tomorrow are my favorite ones. It was always my favorite one to do because you're talking about surveys, and I love surveys. And I'm going to show you L'Oreal is going to show you either really good or really bad surveys, or somewhere in between, and you get to sort of critique other people's terrible work. And I promise you, anything you see is actually real. I didn't make it up. So if you see one of the worst surveys ever made by humankind, it's real. I didn't make it up. I actually took it from someone at the university who honestly actually fielded that instrument. And when you see it, you'll laugh because it's pretty useful as an example of what not to do. So, all right. Any questions before I kind of jump in? Nay. You all just are aching to hear about systemic sampling. Just dying. All right. Okay. So, systemic sampling, right? So we talked about simple random sampling last time, right, where you have your population and then you get your sampling frame. And then you randomly select, you figure out your sample size and you randomly select that many elements out of your sampling frame. So systemic sampling is kind of similar in a way. And again, it's not going to be useful in every single situation because of how it's structured. Okay, so whereas simple random sampling, right, you used a random number generator of some kind to pick your elements, right, or to pick the units that you were studying. In systemic sampling, you will pick, basically, you pick a sort of interval, right? So within your sampling frame, you would do the same thing, right? So you would number, within your sampling frame, you would number every single element from 1 to, I don't know, say 50,000 just for kicks, right? So you number everything from 1 to 50, or actually, let's make a smaller number, 1 to 5,000. Let's say 1 to 5,000. And then what you would do in systemic sampling, as opposed to simple random sampling, you choose numbers at random. Basically, in systemic sampling, you choose some kind of interval. So there's no, and I being the size of the sampling interval. So it can be anything you want, right? So it would depend, like, I don't know, let's say out of 5,000, right, you wanted a sample size of 500. So you would take every, 10? Oh, I can't do math. Every 50th or whatever. Every 10th, let's say. So you would choose every 10th, right? So you would choose, element 10, element 20, element 30, right? So there you go. And that's all it would be. Or if, you had a smaller sample and you wanted to pick every third one, you go 3, 6, 9, 12, 15. Whatever your interval is, you just pick all of the elements that are numbered that. Okay. So instead of being random, it's at every interval. So, to begin, choose a number from I to I, right? From L to, from 1 to 30 or 1 to I, whatever your interval is. And sometimes this is called like random start, right? That number is known as the random start number, so that's where you pick it up. And the case with that number is the first one selected. So right here in this sample on my slightly sketchy, slightly stolen graphic, they're obviously their interval is 3, so they're picking 3 as their random start, and then 6, and then 9. Okay, so systemic sampling is pretty simple to explain, right? You just pick elements that fall within whatever interval you chose for whatever reason you chose it. Okay, that said, a potential problem with systemic sampling is periodicity. And this is if for some reason your sampling frame was arranged in some systemic order. So what ended up happening is whatever interval you hit, you're oversampling or just sampling all of one type and none of the other, right? So for instance, let's say you organized your sample. That's terrible. I'm going to try that again. You had man. Actually, why don't I just do this? M and W. That'll be easier than me drawing symbols. So, man, woman, man, woman, man, woman, right? And you picked every second interval. So you're like, we're going to pick interval 2. So this is 2, this is 4, this is 6, right? You would get only women, right, in this particular sample, right? So that would be periodicity, or, in the case, the example here, voter, non-voter, voter, non-voter. If you were to go with every 30th case, starting with case 20, it would be 20, 50, 80. All the cases would be non-voters, right? Because if all of your even numbered elements were non-voters, you would only be sampling non-voters. So you just have to make sure that your sampling frame isn't systemically organized. Otherwise, it's going to screw up your sample at the end of the day. Okay. Does that make sense? That one's pretty easy. Okay. Stratified random sampling is also pretty straightforward. Basically, when you're doing stratified random sampling, you're doing it in order that your sample matches basically characteristics of the total sample. Okay, so, and proportionally, right? I guess proportionally is the word that you want. So here, right, in this case, you have a population of 20 individuals, my little graphic, right? 20 individuals, 40 of them are black, 40 of them are gray, or 30% are gray, 40% are black, 30% are gray, and 30% are yellow, right? So if you're doing stratified sampling, you want to make sure that, your smaller sample, in this case 10, is going to have the same characteristics as the population, right? So, you would make sure that 40% of them, or 4 in the case of a 10-person sample, are black, 3 are gray, 3 are orange. Okay, so that's honestly, it's not too complex, right? So if let's say you were doing a study of, students at U of A, and you wanted to, do I have this on the next slide, or? Yes, actually, I'll show you the difference here, right? Let's say that this is your population of, let's say the U of J, University of Jeff. Okay, right, so I started my own university and this is its theoretical population, right? So it has a total of 9,000 students because, like Donald Trump, I'm an excellent con man and I managed to convince 9,000 people to sign up for my university. I'm kidding, I'm not a con man. 1,800 of them are in humanities, 1,200 are in social science, natural science, business, and engineering. So what you want, right, a stratified sample will basically kind of hold these percentages of the total student population pretty consistent, right? So you're going to get, so basically, out of your sample of 450, these percentages are going to match, right? They're going to match this percentage of that total population. So your sample is going to, at the end of the day, match exactly what your population looks like in terms of kind of proportions. So you can kind of see the advantage here, right? If you look at the, a hypothetical simple random sample or systemic sample, what you can see, right, humanities are slightly undersampled there by about 5. Social sciences are oversampled by 10. Your natural sciences are oversampled by 20 people. Business is undersampled by 6. Engineering is way down, right? They're down by, like 21 or 29. I can do math, right? To 100, yeah. 19. I can do math. Okay, these ones are under by 19, okay? So you see that some of these are out of proportion, right? Some are oversampled, some are undersampled, because when you pick the elements at random or even through a systemic sample, you're not going to get those same proportions that you would ultimately get, if you did a stratified sample. So if you want your sample to proportionally match your population, stratified sample is a good way to go. Now then, within these, each of these, right, you would still randomly select, or through a systemic sample, your 90 out of 1,800, right? So you would number these elements 1 to 1,800, and then you would randomly select 90 of those, or figure out your interval or whatever. Same thing here, right? You would, out of your 1,200, you would sample 60 randomly, and so on and so forth, right? So you're still doing a random sample using either a simple random sampling method. You're just making sure that you're selecting enough elements from each of these categories, right? That you're getting them all. Okay, does that make sense? You're like, yes, so simple. Well, since you all think that was easy, multi-stage cluster sampling. This one's a little bit more complicated. Okay, let me explain if I can. So, multi-stage cluster sampling, again, within each of these, you're going to do some kind of random sampling. I know this is actually a really terrible picture and tells you absolutely nothing, because it's like circle, smaller circle, star. But it's actually, like, once you kind of understand what it is, it's actually pretty straightforward. So you tend to use this for a couple of things. Large populations, where you might not have an adequate sample frame, right? Or you might not know what it is, or you have elements that are geographically dispersed. Okay, so 2 stages typically, or more. Clusters, selecting clusters, your group of elements, and then selecting any subunits within your clusters. Okay, So the example that I always give for this is pretty straightforward. Let's say you wanted to do a study of Canadian university students, right? So we maybe have a rough idea of how many university students there are in Canada. However many, I think you can look it up. A couple million, I believe. But they're geographically dispersed. So what you would do for something like this, say, is you would create your first set of clusters. And you would then select kind of subunits from below. So if we're doing Canadian universities, you could do something like, okay, you're going to take from universities in BC, the Prairies, Ontario, Quebec, and the Maritimes, right? So you start with that. Those would be, your 5 initial clusters in your multi-stage cluster sampling. Okay, now you want to make sure, again, that you have a good kind of sampling within that. So let's say you wanted to, so you would probably sample more from Ontario and Quebec because they're larger provinces, right? A little bit less from the Prairies and the Maritimes, and BC somewhere in the middle. So then you select your next kind of clusters, right? Okay, so in BC, right? Let's say you pick UBC and maybe UVic, right? Those would be your two sites, your 2 parts of like subclusters, okay? And then from the Prairies, you go U of A, and I don't know, let's say University of Lethbridge. Ontario, okay, no, I'm saying the Prairies. I can't do just Alberta. Let's say U of S and University of Manitoba. Ontario, I don't know, let's say U of T, which I'm told is the Harvard of Canada by people who went to U of T. Let's say Queens, McMaster, I don't know, and I don't know, maybe a couple others. I can't think of, let's pick 2 or 3 more because Ontario's big. Quebec, McGill, U Laval, University of Montreal, Université de Montréal, and then from the Maritimes, I don't know, let's just say Dalhousie. I think there are other schools in the Maritimes, but I can't think of any of them right now. And the Maritimes are relatively unpopulous, right? Okay, so you've got your subclusters, right? So you've picked your subclusters within each of these, and then from these you could pick further subclusters, right? So let's say you wanted to do, proportions for engineering, social science, humanities, etc., right? You could do these at each of these universities, right? So already there you see you've got kind of multi-stage clusters, right? So you kind of move down where, these are your provinces, these are your schools, and these are the units within those schools. And then basically you select your units within those subclusters, right? Let's say, you wanted, and I'm not thinking this out in like systemic terms, so just bear with me, right? You wanted to keep it proportional for each of these schools. So you sample, X number of students from each of the kind of major faculties within it, at each of these schools in rough proportions. So let's say, I don't know, you want 3,000 here, 2,000 here, 300 here, 1,000 here, and 1,200 here. Again, I'm just making these numbers up. And then you would kind of break it down, into those departments of those universities from those different places. And all of that is done using random sampling, right? So you would do, I don't know, simple random sampling, stratified sampling, or whatever. I guess I kind of set it up as stratified sampling within the clusters, so that you would get in this sort of setup, you would get a broad sense of university students in Canada, right? You would get, and from all the different regions, by setting up these different clusters where you're gathering the data. So does that kind of make sense? Have I explained multi-stage cluster sampling in a way that was less confusing than the diagram that's there? Okay, yeah, please. I'm just making it up. Yeah, just, for example, you wanted, your sample size of 1,200 from BC, 1,000 from the prairies, 3,000 from Ontario. Yeah, please.
So we so like 2/3 of the for red and purple, but only 1/2 for blue and yellow. Isn't that not representative?
Oh, this diagram?
Yeah.
I don't know. I didn't make the diagram. I just Googled multi-stage cluster sampling and put it up there as an illustration. So I think it's probably best not to dwell too much on this particular drawing. Yeah, please.
Are you aiming for proportional, like by the end of all of this different clustering, like we would with systematic sampling?
So you don't have to, right? Like you could set it up, and that's kind of how I roughly imagined this imagined example that I just made up just now. You wouldn't have to, right? You wouldn't have to make it proportional necessarily. You could set it up just as a raw sample size where you're drawing from each of these areas so that you're getting a broadly dispersed, like because university students in Canada are a broadly dispersed population, and you just want to make sure that you capture some from each section. In this particular example, I think it would make sense to try and be proportional about it because, you might end up, I don't know, I'm just imagining, if you oversampled from Alberta or from the prairies, it might skew your whole results, right, compared to undersampling from, say, Quebec. So I would want to balance this one out proportionally, right? Figure out how much of the student population in Canada is from Quebec and make sure I'm sampling at least that. But you wouldn't necessarily have to. You could just be like, I'm going to grab from a big pool, and I want to make sure that I grab from different clusters so I'm getting that diversity, right? Does that make sense? Okay. I think you should do it proportionally, but you don't necessarily have to. All right. Other questions about multi-stage cluster sampling? Okay. So, issues with multi-stage cluster sampling. It's technically much more complicated. So, not all clusters are the same size, so you have to take account of that. If you want to make it proportional, you have to work that out. Cluster samples are usually stratified as well, right? So you have strata and subgroups. How do you deal with those? And how far down do you go, right? How far do you break this down before you kind of suggest that's good enough, right? Do you need 5 substrata? Who knows? In the example that the textbook uses is similar to this, right? If you want to sample people from across Canada, right, you could break it down into BC, Prairies, Ontario, Atlantic provinces, and Northern Territories. But some of these contain more than one, right? The Prairies especially, and the Atlantic region, and I guess the Territories contain their own subclusters. So I kind of dealt with that in my example by, when I was looking at the Prairies, grabbing one school from each of the Prairie provinces. Initially, I just said Lethbridge, but I got better, and I made sure I included Saskatchewan and Manitoba as well. So you could do that, right? But there's always going to be complexities within multi-stage cluster sampling. So none of it is impossible, right? You can pick, you can break down those clusters. You can figure out how you're going to make it work. But it is much more complicated than simpler sampling methods. So, fun times. Okay. Oh, see, I told you this slide was somewhere, and I just couldn't remember where it was. And here it is, right? The absolute size of the sample matters, not the proportion of the population that it comprises, right? So, as sample size goes up, and I said this already last class, sampling error tends to decrease. Our common ones, 100 is too small, but 400, 900, 1600, 2500, 3000, 4000 are also pretty common. But then, right, as I said, sampling error cuts, when you go to 100, from 100 to 400, you cut the sampling error down by half. Then from 400 to 900, you cut it down by a third, then a quarter, then a fifth, and that decrease in sampling error gets smaller and smaller the bigger you go, right? So you're not decreasing sampling error that much by going bigger. And the biggest change occurs between 100 and 400. Okay, what I'll say for your purposes for the major lab, right? And again, this is pretty straightforward. I would say never go with a sample size smaller than 300. And this is just a kind of, and even as you go forward, if you're doing kind of survey research or any big social research, any smaller than 300, it's not that the data is useless, it's that doing the really cool statistics stuff basically gets impossible. So if you want to do like multilinear regressions, right, or even bivariate regression, any of the really cool statistical wizardry, 300 is basically sort of your baseline. Below that, it really doesn't work very well. And you're not going to find a ton of stuff. You know, you're going to end up doing crosstabs and correlation analysis. And those are valuable. They are. But they're much less valuable and they yield much less interesting data than, you know, the kind of stuff you can do with bigger sample sizes. So I had a friend who's very much a statistician, and what she suggested to me was that for the most part, what you should aim for is a minimum of 400 as a sample size. That gives you a lot of ability to do some of the fancy statistical analysis without necessarily increasing your cost in gathering data too much, right? But, you know, when you go up to 900, 1600, 2500 or bigger, the more data you have, the more you can do statistically speaking. But 400 is where the really cool stuff starts to be possible. 300 is the barrier below which you can do very little with the data. Again, possible, but much, much more difficult, and you're going to get way less interesting results because there's just not enough data to really generate a lot of interesting, statistical information. So I would say, you know, again, just for your purposes, when you're suggesting your sample size, somewhere between 300 and 3,000, depending on the project you're kind of talking about, is usually like really good. Stay away from like suggesting massive sample sizes. Like there are certainly some studies, right, like the National Study of Family Forms where they're doing like 15,000 surveys. That's really pretty rare. And I mean, and occasionally this happens that people are like, I'm going to, you know, survey 1 million people. Sorry, Austin Powers joke. 1 million people. That's absurd, right? Like you would never okay, if you're a billionaire and you're going to sink $1 billion into surveying 1 million people, maybe, but these kinds of numbers are really hard. Even 15,000, right? It's going to take you a lot of time to gather 15,000 responses to any survey. So I would say, like, keep your, you know, when I'm looking at you're doing your sampling method and your sample size on your major lab, keep it within this range, and that's sort of the range of, you know, sadly, reality. And it will suggest to me and to L'Oreal that you've actually understood, you know, sampling methods better than if you're like 1 million people. Okay, so how am I doing here? I feel like I went through that really quick. Oh, we have all our non-probability sampling to do still. Good times. Okay. Sample size, right? Non-response. We talked about this last class. And because I like to repeat myself, apparently, the response rate is the percentage of the sample that participates in the study. If there is some particular issue common to non-responders that brings them to differ in some important way, non-response. So non-response, right? It skews your data, especially if there's some particular way that your non-respondents are different from those who participate. So historically, the big one, you know, as we've shifted away from phone polling to online polling, I love that this pen as opposed to the one on my other laptop has an eraser on it. I don't know why. It just makes me so happy. So for a while, right, one of the big differences was landline versus cell phone. And so we were oversampling people that had landlines, and these people were old, versus younger people who only had a cell phone, who typically were younger. So, yeah. In that, that non-response, what you weren't getting, were people, you were randomly dialing cell phone numbers and people saw it on their call display and weren't answering. So you weren't getting young people, you were getting too many older, typically more educated people. And therefore, there was something about that non-response sample that was different from your main sample. And that's typically true, right? There's going to be something different about your non-responders and you miss capturing that data. Okay. And generally, the greater the heterogeneity of your heterogeneity, I can pronounce words in English, heterogeneity of your population, the larger your sample size should be. So, okay, let's put it to you this way. If you were trying to do, a study in Finland, Finland is a highly homogeneous population, right? Everybody's Nordic or Finnish. Everybody's blonde. Not everybody. Actually, of my 3 Finnish friends, 2 of them aren't blonde, so I've lied to you. But it's a highly homogeneous population, right? And so if you were doing a study in Finland, and it's also a relatively small country, only about 5 million, in Finland you could get away with a much smaller sample size. Because, even a small sample size, you're probably going to capture a pretty good slice of, what the Finnish population is like. However, if you went to the US, right, or Trump-Ganistan, as I think we'll start to call it, a very heterogeneous population, right? Massive, what is the US population now? 370 some million, very ethnically diverse between regions. You're going to need a much larger sample size in the US to truly capture, what's going on in the population. So in Finland, you probably could get away with 300. In the US, you probably need at least 3,000 or more, right? To really capture, how heterogeneous that population is. So the more diverse a population, the larger sample you should get to try and capture as much of that heterogeneity as possible. Okay. Oh, I ruined all my stuff again. The kind of analysis, depending on, the sample size is going to depend on the sort of analysis that you're going to do. I would always say bigger is better. And again, I would say like 400 is the minimum to at least allow you to attempt things like, bivariate or multivariate regressions. Yeah, if you have a smaller group within, let's say you have a smaller group within a population and you want to compare it to the larger group, it might be necessary to oversample the smaller group in order to make meaningful comparisons. So if you've ever looked at, say, American social science data, right? America has something like, I think between 1 and 2% of the population is Jewish. So if you wanted to, say anything about American Jews, one of the things you couldn't do is just take a broad sample of, Americans, right? Let's say you did a 1,500 person sample of American Jews, of Americans, right? You're going to get like 15 maybe cases of Jewish people. Not enough really to say anything meaningful, right? Because that's only 15 individual units. So if you wanted to make some kind of broader comparison of Jewish people to the American population, you'd have to oversample this population, to some extent, right? You'd have to go maybe to 150 so that you had enough Jewish people in your sample that you could say, okay, well, this is what these 150 Jewish people look like. Same thing with like, you know, in the US, Muslims, Hindus, Sikhs, right? They're all tend to be clustered. Like if you look at the General Social Survey from NORC, they all tend to be classified under other because there's just not enough of them, you know, in that particular sample to say anything really super meaningful. And I know people who've worked with this data and are like, oh yeah, we can say this about American Jews, but there's only 15 of them in the sample. So, you know, that's probably not going to actually tell us much of anything. So if you really wanted to say something about, you know, Jewish people or Mormons, or actually Mormons have a decent amount. It's a bad example. Any kind of subgroup that's really small, you probably have to grab more of them in your sample than, you know, actually makes sense given the size of their population. But if you want to compare this, you know, this 1% to the rest of the 99, you'd have to grab a bigger chunk of it, or you just don't have enough data to say anything particularly meaningful. Okay. I'll just check. What time is it? All right. Good. Good. Everything's going well. Everything is wonderful. So, convenience sampling. Convenience sampling is much more, you know, I know we're talking about quantitative sampling, is much more typical of qualitative sampling, with one quick exception that I'll explain to you in a second. Okay, qualitative sampling. So, I'm going to switch my colors here to green. So convenience sampling, right, it's exactly what it sounds like. Your cases or your elements or units are included because they are available, right? So the typical thing you get with convenience sampling is whoever will talk to you, right? So let's say that I'm just trying to think of an example. Okay, let's say that you wanted to talk to people on campus who are members of a particular subculture, right? Let's say furries, for no particular reason. You wanted to talk to furries on campus, right? So you would put out a call on, I don't know, let's say Reddit. By the way, not a great idea. Recruiting on Reddit used to work really well, and now it's a very different and very dark place. So don't do it. I was successful at doing this, but that was a few years ago before the pandemic. And now my understanding is you get a lot of crazy. So, but let's say you were recruiting on Reddit, right? And you wanted to talk to, you know, people on campus who are students who are also furries. Your sample is going to be whoever responds to that, right? So it is convenience sample because it's convenient because they came to you and they are willing to talk. That's what convenience sampling essentially is. Now, you can't generally generalize. You can't generalize from convenience samples because you didn't select them randomly, right? It's not a probability sample, so you can't assume you know, that they somehow are representative of the population. So, in quantitative terms, convenience samples are good for pilot studies. Testing the reliability of the measures to be used, right? So you want to test your survey or your instrument. Developing ideas, right? We've talked about this. Maybe you don't know about a subject and you want to gather some information. So you do, you know, a pilot study, and then you use that pilot study to further, you know, maybe lots of open questions. Use that to develop your quantitative tools, your survey tools, and that stuff, or learning how to do research. You know, you're a baby researcher and you need to learn how to do research. So you use a convenient sample just so that you can play around with some data. Okay. So our most common type of convenience sampling, and again, if you ever do qualitative sampling, or multi-level marketing, in a lot of cases, you're doing snowball sampling, right? So Snowball sampling, this is a hill. This is your snowball at the top. You roll it down. By the end, it's bigger, right? So what does snowball sampling look like, and why did I say it's, are you asking what's multi-level marketing? Multi-level. Multi-level marketing. And this is kind of a joke, because right, if you've ever been to like, do you have any friends who like sell Epicure spices, or know anyone? You know, at the end of the party, they always ask, hey, would you have any other friends who would be willing to like host an Epicure party? Or that's essentially snowball sampling, right? So if you were doing snowball sampling, right, let's say you get an interview with one person. At the end of that interview, you ask that one person if they know anybody else who they think would be interested in talking to you, and then you contact that person or have them contact them for you, and then that becomes your person number 2. And then you ask them, you know, and that becomes your person number 3. And basically, like a snowball rolling down the hill, hopefully your sample gets bigger and bigger as you do more interviews, right? You're building. And that's, like I said, it's kind of a joke. Multi-level marketing is kind of the same model, right? You kind of try and build over time, gathering more and more people through recommendations so that your sample grows. Yeah, Rich.
Would those field surveys be sampling too? Because like, not everybody knows about it.
Okay, so they are more what I would call quota sampling. So they're on my next slide. I'll explain that in a sec. But yeah, they're more quota sampling. And this is one of the, I think, strong critiques of a lot of things like, so that's Leger's online survey platform, Leo, right? That's what you're talking about? Yeah. Leger, one of the big polling firms in Canada, they have this platform called Leo that you can go on and earn points and do surveys. Reg has been taking my advice and seeing other surveys, but I'll talk about quota sampling in a sec. Yeah, please.
So is this also like with the multi-level marketing, the whole thing kind of like
Yes, multi-level marketing is kind of a pyramid. Well, okay, it's only a pyramid scheme if the goal, if it's just like, could you recommend me to your friends so that I can do more of my showings and they could buy more stuff? That's not a pyramid scheme. It would only become a pyramid scheme if the goal is to sign you up as like a consultant. So like, I sign you up as a consultant and then I get a share of your money, any money you make. That's more of a pyramid scheme. Sometimes multi-level marketing is like that, but sometimes it's just like, you recommend me to your friends, I go sell them some spices that are going to sit in their cupboard for 75 years. Or Tupperware that they're never going to use because it sits, I guess Tupperware went out of business, didn't they? But you basically, right, only if you're trying to sign people up to also be salesmen for this thing, then it becomes a pyramid scheme. What's the one that they tried to recruit me into and I got mad at them because they wouldn't explain what their business model was? I think it was Amway. I kept meeting with these people who were like, you could make so much money doing this. And I'm like, yes, but what is it? And they wouldn't tell me after like 3 meetings. And I was like, okay, either you tell me now what it is you're asking me to do. I wasn't going to do it anyway. I was just curious because it was like the 4th time someone had approached me randomly and I wanted to find out what this was. And they're like, it's Amway. I'm like, oh, it's Amway? Come on, guys. You could have just said that and I would have been gone an hour ago. Anyway, that's more a pyramid scheme. Amway is more of a pyramid scheme. But honestly, the only reason I say multi-level marketing is because it's the same thing. It's like a referral, right? And that's essentially what you're doing when you're kind of snowballing your sample, is you're trying to get a referral from one person that you're doing, say, a survey or interview with, to the next person, to the next person, and then to the next person. So eventually you have a fair size sample. But you're just gathering, referrals from the people you're interviewing. Okay. Yeah, so for example, students who participate in the survey studies are asked to come up with the names of some non-students who might be willing to participate, right? But mostly you make contact with individuals who in turn provide you with other contacts, right? And this is really common. Like when I was doing my Russian TV study, I started with like 2 people. I met someone at a conference. They gave me 2 names. I went to those people. I'm like, hey, I did an interview with them. And my last question was, would you be willing to kind of look through your Rolodex and think through if there's anyone else you think would like to talk to me and maybe contact them for me just let them know what I'm doing and recommend them. And I picked up about 20 interviews doing this. I wasn't able to use all of them, but you kind of I picked them up, and every interview that was my question, and eventually I got a nice, like, decent interview sample out of it. So that's snowball sampling. And again, when we come back to qualitative sampling, this will be much more useful. It's a really typical method people use in qualitative. Okay, quota sampling, which I will say I think is really common in online survey platforms today. Okay, so you collect a specified number of cases in particular categories to match the proportion of cases in the category of the population. Okay, so what does that mean, right? So here, what you wouldn't have is a sample frame. So you would not have a sample frame because sample frames are really, really hard. So you know how last class I was sort of describing to you how they used to do things like mail surveys, where they would mail surveys to every 5th house in a particular postal code, and that's how they would do it. In a lot of cases today, because populations are so mobile, phone numbers mean nothing, everything's so dispersed, you might not have a very good sample frame to draw from. Like if you wanted like a public opinion poll, you might not really have a great sample frame, right? Because you can't randomly dial phone numbers and guess that you're going to get people from a certain area. So, or if you have people signing on to your online survey platform, it's not necessarily a representative sample. Your sample frame, I guess, is people who signed up for your platform, but that's not going to necessarily be a random sample. So what you do, and you'll notice this if you do any of these, is you select or you collect a specified number of cases, right? So your units in particular categories to match the proportion of the cases in that category. Okay, so let's say that you are, let's say you are wanting to do Canada. And you know that, I'm just making this number up, this is not true, 15% of Canadians are men between the ages of 34 and 40. Again, I'm just making that up. So what you would do is you would collect, men between 34 and 40 until it reached about 15% of the total number you were looking for, right? So let's say you were doing, 1,500, you're collecting 1,500 responses, you'd figure out 15% of 1,500, and then you would do your screening questions at the beginning of the survey. So it'd be like, hey, how old are you? Oh, okay, you're, 34 to 40, good. And you're male, great. Oh, and I've had this happen, right, where I'm doing these surveys, and it's like, actually, we've already reached the number of responses for your category that we were looking for. And that's a really good on these online platforms, right? So we've already hit, people in your age group with your number of kids or whatever that we were aiming for. So thank you for participating. Here's 1 point on our point system. Now, go away. So that's a good indication that you're in a quota sample, right? They're looking to collect enough cases within a particular demographic that they think is going to be representative of the population. And once they fill that, they stop collecting more samples in that category. And so they'll collect, 18 to 24 and 20, on and on, and until they fill up those kind of categories. Okay, so yeah, so in that kind of sample, there would be quotas for age, gender, ethnicity, class, income levels, whatever it happens to be. Okay, so there's some debate about this. I actually think quota sampling is fine. There is some argument that quota sampling does not mean, generalizability, because you're not using random methods to fill these quotas. And I remember, I had done this survey in Edmonton, and I was presenting it to the people who had funded it, and they had a couple of people coming in, and they were peppering me with questions like, okay, well, we know that, I was using Abacus data, that they use this kind of quota sampling to build their database, right? And so this is not, what you're saying is interesting, but it's not necessarily representative. And I was like, no, quota sampling's fine, because, while your kind of sampling frame isn't set, you're still going to get something that looks a lot like the general population. Even though, you didn't use simple random or stratified random sampling, you're still getting, a variety of cases within categories that look similar to the population. You're just using a different method to get there. So quota sampling, like I said, is not considered probability sampling because you're not using random sampling methods. I think it's fine. I actually think, given the environment today, quota sampling is probably the way to go. That's an opinion. If you say you're going to do simple random sampling, I will not dock you marks unless it makes no sense. But I do think quota sampling in the kind of environment that we're in today makes a ton of sense, right? It's actually really, I think, the way to go. Again, not random to fill your quotas. You're just basically sending out a bunch of surveys or placing it in an app. In the case of like Leo, you're placing it in the app and waiting for people to respond. And when you get enough regs, then you close that part of the sample and you collect until you're done, right? I don't know how many regs you need, but however many you need. There you go. So sorry, does that make sense? Do you understand quota sampling? Okay, good. Strengths of quota sampling. Cheaper, easier to manage compared to random sampling. Yeah, definitely. And like I said, I think most of if you go to 338canada.com and you look at most of the pollsters, they're all doing quota sampling, right? None of them are really doing simple random or any kind of probability sampling. They're all essentially doing this. Why? Because it's cheaper and easier. They have their online sample bases. They can conduct it really quickly compared to random sampling methods. And with a far lower, you're going to get a way lower non-response rate. Now it is opt-in, so that is a problem. Good for pilot test exploratory research, but I actually think increasingly it's fine. Again, not probability sampling, but it's fine. You can use it, no problem. And you can generalize off of it reasonably well. Okay. Not likely to be representative. I think that's kind of true and it isn't. It depends on the methodology used to get to your quota. Judgments about eligibility might be incorrect. Researcher might misjudge a person's age, mistakenly avoid that person. Again, this is true of you picking people randomly. But if you're doing something like an online survey platform, that's not a problem because you're using screening questions, so no big deal. You're actually doing pretty well. Not appropriate to calculate a standard error term from quota sampling. We won't even worry about that. But yeah, it's not probability sampling, so you can't calculate things like error from it. Okay. Oh, structured observation. We haven't talked about structured observation, and we shan't. So I'm actually just I forgot this was here before I took out. So I'm just gonna cross this slide off entirely. You may do so as well. I'm gonna doodle on it. Okay, so limits to generalization in quantitative research. I'm just gonna check how much I have left. Just a few slides. Okay. Even when the sample you selected using probability sampling, any finding can only be generalized to the population from which the sample was taken, right? So, if you do Canadians, it's only generalizable to Canadians. Albertans, only generalizable to Albertans. U of A students, it only applies to them. You can't say, okay, we did this study at U of A, which means all Canadian university students feel the same, right? Only the population from which it was taken. And for the most part, when you're talking about, a cross-sectional kind of thing, so a cross-section, it really only applies to that snap in time. 3 weeks later, things might be different, right? Circumstances might change. This is like, political polling. If you looked back 3 weeks ago or a month ago, right, and you saw, the conservatives were up at, what was it, like 44% of the total popular vote, and everyone was like, Pierre Poilievre, yay, balloons. This is a balloon. I don't know what it is now. It's supposed to be a balloon, anyway. But then you look back, a few weeks later, and now the CPC is down to 33%, now that everyone thinks Mark Carney is going to be the leader of the Conservatives, right? So people's attitudes here only reflected the environment where Justin Trudeau was leader of the opposition, of the government. Once that changes, right, that anything generalizable from that period is no longer going to be true. Okay. Sampling problems, or where sampling errors come from. The biggest one, is obviously screwing up your sampling, how you set up your sampling, or some other sampling related error. So, if you mess up your probability sample and how you collect your sample, you miscalculate your population or your sample frame, right? Any of those things can screw up your data and can create error within sampling. Data collection errors, if there is something wrong with your tool, or let's say it's being done on the phone and there's some kind of problem with how people are putting the data in, right? Let's say people were doing a pen and paper survey, and then when they're going back, they're entering it. I guess that's data processing error. Sorry. Some kind of problem with the way you're collecting data. You have someone, you hire a company and they ask the questions in a way that skews the data collection. That can cause error. And then data processing errors, entering things, or especially when you're going through, and we won't talk about this much, if you're cleaning the data, right, making it workable, and you create an error in cleaning the data, that can screw up. That can create errors in your quantitative research. So don't do any of those things. But again, maybe when you go on to advanced quantitative research, Phil or Michelle can talk to you more about this kind of stuff. It is not an area where I have a ton of expertise. Okay. Oops, I went the wrong way. Okay. Oh, content analysis. Okay, so I'm doing okay. Content analysis. My pen hates me now. So quantitative content analysis is another kind of methodology. We'll talk about content analysis in the qualitative section, and I'll come back and talk a little bit about how you can do it quantitatively. Quantitative content analysis, like if you're looking at content in some kind of quantitative way, typically looks like counting, right? So what would an example of this be? Let's say, okay, you wanted to look at police violence, right? Using quantitative content analysis. You would go and look in kind of newspaper articles from, X period. Let's say, let's say 1980 to 2021. And you would find every article that talked about police violence and look at how they described it, what kind of words and vocabulary was used to describe it, and all of these sorts of things, right? Newspaper articles, from different papers, articles on a given topic, whatever it happens to be, right? So, and then you would count. You'd be like, okay, in this period, this term was used a bunch of times. I guess the way I've seen this done in more recent years is people go on LexisNexis, which is a big kind of database that you can use to search newspaper terms, and they'll be like, in X, because you can set the search parameters. So since 1980, and to the present, they'll look at the frequency of some kind of phrase or a set of terms. So let's think of, let's say settler colonialism. And they'll see okay, in 1980 it was not very many, 2 or 3 times a year, and then starting in 2012, the uses of it exploded, and then you make some kind of determination about what the meaning of that is, or there's all sorts of ways this has been done. Racial justice, any kind of terminology you want to look at, you can enter a bunch of terms in NexusLexis and kind of do a search, and it'll tell you, okay, the New York Times has used this term, this many times in this year, and on forward, right? That's kind of typical quantitative content analysis. Sampling dates, right? You set the dates, or sampling media, right? You said, okay, I want the New York Times. How many times did the New York Times mention this particular topic? I will say this, quantitative content analysis is super boring. I really hate it. I had friends who did this as part of their kind of master's work, and it's extremely dull, and it's extremely dull to read the findings. So I would strongly recommend against doing quantitative content analysis, because it's honestly like, okay, I'm going to look at media portrayals of sex workers for selected years, and then go through the articles and be like, how many times were they called prostitutes? How many times was the word, WHORE used? Whatever it happens to be. How was it described? What's the kind of framing? It's super boring. But if that's your thing, go for it. I came out of a media studies department in Calgary that did a lot of this kind of stuff, and I never found it to be that interesting. Yeah. What's that?
Is your research qualitative?
Oh, much more qualitative, yes. You can go read it. It's super fun and boring. Also, don't read it because it's embarrassing. So, Reg read it. I don't know why. It's probably blackmail, so we can use it against me later. Okay. Oh, 2 more slides. Okay. And then I'll talk a little bit about the midterm. Okay. So, reducing non-response. So, for telephone interviews, callbacks are useful. And here, this is where you'll be familiar with this. Reassure the prospective participants you are not in it for material gain, or you're not a scammer, right, trying to steal their information. So, how many times do you do callbacks? Do you ever have to call back the same number? Okay, and if they don't answer, then you give up? So 6 times total?
But it's for different surveys.
Okay, that's
kind of the same survey compilation.
interesting. That's not fun. Okay, like I said, phone interviews are getting more rare because either you need unpaid slave labor to do it for you, or she works for free doing phone interviews. Someone has enslaved her. Someone free her. Yeah, and I know you've said people think you're in it for some kind of purpose, and you have to assure them that you're not. For face-to-face, right, dress appropriately and be flexible with participants. Now, dress appropriately is funny because I've learned that this can mean a lot of really interesting things, depending on the circumstance. Like, I know all of our researchers who went into prison, a lot of them are young women, and they were advised to dress very conservatively, but no hoodies, right? So they weren't to dress provocatively or look too nice because, going into prisons, that sent out the wrong signal, and that was going to kind of push people away, but no hoodies because you didn't want anything people could grab. So sweaters, a lot of sweaters, very unrevealing sweaters. But generally, right, you're wanting to dress professionally in some way. I think they were told, don't dress too professionally going into prisons because then you look like a narc, right? I was told I shouldn't bother because I look too much like a cop, so no one was ever going to talk to me. And I'm like, that's cool. Didn't want to do your stupid research anyway. I actually don't have time. So dress appropriately, right? Especially if I went in like this, they'd be like, you a cop? I'm like, I'm wearing a pink shirt. Do cops wear pink shirts? I have no idea. I don't have enough. I had one student say to me, you don't have enough visible tattoos and piercings to do research with this population. I was like, fair. So I should get like a face tattoo and then I can go into prison. I feel like that's totally me. Like a heart or a canary or something. Okay. Be flexible and accommodate participants. If you're meeting people in person, you're going to have to accommodate people. For mailed questionnaires, right? Again, almost no one does these anymore. I won't even read these. But I guess I told you about one. I did like the research diaries for media. Yeah, you need a cover letter explaining the reason for research. If you know the respondent's name, that's helpful. If you're asking, nobody does this anymore. Now you just put a QR code on the letter and people go to a website to do it. Again, that's not even a thing. I should take this section out because no one mails out things. Monetary incentives. Increase the response rate but can be unethical. Like my media diary where they mailed me $1 and then $2 and said if I did another one they would send me $5, but I took my $2 and didn't do the third one because I didn't want to. Okay. All right, and virtual sampling issues. Online surveys, right? Not everyone is online or has the technical ability to do questionnaires. That's less true as time goes on, but certainly like, vulnerable populations, unhoused people, incarcerated people, people who are poor may not be able to get online, and they're going to be really hard to reach with online questionnaires. So online questionnaires do tend to skew to kind of people that are more middle and upper class. So it can be hard to get kind of more working class or poor people to do them. Internet users are a biased sample of the population, especially heavy internet users that are likely to sign up for online survey platforms, especially. They're going to be a particular type of person. So again, your quota sampling is going to be important, but not going to, necessarily provide generalizable information all the time. Okay. And few sampling frames exist for the general online population, which is why you do screening, right, to figure out who your people are. Okay. All right. That is it for probability sampling. That's my last slide. Okay, how are we doing for time? I'm doing amazing. Okay, so much better than sociology of youth, where I've overgone on one topic heavily because I find it interesting. And I can. Okay. All right, so I'm going to talk midterm very quickly, and I'll take questions if you have any. So the midterm is really straightforward. It's 30 multiple choice questions, and you can get a sense of what they look like by looking at the practice. Sorry, that's not a comment aimed at you. That's not a comment. She's like, are we going to get any practice before class? She's like, are we going to get any practice questions? I'm like, I thought I already posted them, and they were there. You can get a really good idea of what they're like, but they're all kind of informational, right? They're all just about stuff that's covered in the slides. So there's no, and no textbook, no extra questions from topics in the textbook that I didn't talk about or anything like that. It's all, very straightforward. So everything from the beginning of the course until today, so quantitative or like what is social research all the way to quantitative sampling, it's all going to be covered. And then 4 short answer questions split into 2 sections. So the first section is kind of definitions. And the second section is application. So definition is straightforward, right? So it's just terms from the course, and it'll be like, define positivist epistemology. In what kind of research would it be used? Why? Like that's the kind of question that's going to be really straightforward as long as you kind of know the material. And I know there's been a lot. Yes.
Sorry, just to add on to that, since you said it's 4 short answers, that means you only have like 2 definitions and then 2 applications.
Correct. Yeah. So 2 definition, 2 application, right? So yeah, it'll be something really straightforward. Terms you've seen in class, you have to define them, maybe compare to, right? There's always the compare positivist and interpretivist epistemology, blah, blah, blah. What circumstance would it be used in? And I think there's practice questions for those in the practice question exam. And then the application one is I'm going to give you something, right? I'm going to give you a scenario. I may want to rewrite them. But I'll give you some kind of scenario, right? This is Dr. Broussard. He wants to do this kind of research. Write a research question, right? Or, this is what he wants to research. What are the variables and operationalize one or two of them for me, right? So what are the big skills that you've kind of done? So research question, right? Variables. So you've operationalized, so you might have to do that. You know, validity, you might be asked about validity. You know, probably it's going to be validity, it's going to be face validity. You know, how does this meet face validity? And then of course, okay, so I'm thinking, I mean, I've made you do like an ethics letter. So maybe, you know, you might have to tell me parts of an ethics letter, right? Or the information and consent letter rather, that stuff. And then the one that you're going to do tomorrow with L'Oreal and then submit an assignment is survey questions, right? So I might give you a topic and ask you to write survey questions to get information about that topic, right? So I think those would be the 6 kind of big things that might be on the midterm in terms of the application questions, right? So all stuff that you've done before, all stuff that you've gotten a little bit of feedback on from L'Oreal or from myself. Could be any of those. I won't tell you which because otherwise you're just gonna, well, I mean, you wouldn't be able to prepare anyway because I'm gonna give you a scenario and it's gonna be probably kind of wacky because I enjoy the wackiness. Don't worry, the scenarios for the qualitative stuff are way wackier, like so much wackier than the quantitative ones. Okay, so basically that's it, right? 30 multiple choice questions on content, 4 short answer, which is like 2 that are definitional and 2 that are application based, and that's basically it. Any questions? Yeah, please.
Just to, I guess, kind of confirm, will the exam be like handwritten with a scan shot, or will we just be doing it like on?
You will. Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, you'll just be doing it on your laptop in the class here. No one will be allowed to sit in the back row so that I can walk around and spy on you. But aside from that, yeah, basically, only because one time someone was using ChatGPT in the back row and I couldn't get to them to prove it, so now no one can sit in the back row. They didn't do well. It writes bad survey questions. It's still not very good at it. And it was kind of obvious. But plus another student pointed it out to me. So your friends are not your friends are your enemies. And they will destroy you for their own benefit. Yeah, Reg.
Might be a silly question, but for the multiple choice, is that just what's on the slides, or like is there also stuff that you like elaborated on?
Oh, well, I mean, yes. So everything that's on the slide, I kind of like tried to explain in more detail. That said, there won't be any multiple choice questions that are based purely on my wackiness or my, you know, the examples that I like doodled quickly on the slide. Because half the time when I'm writing the questions, I can't remember what my doodles were either. And there's no way I'm going back to watch my own videos to write questions specifically on my own wacky hijinks. Does that answer your question? Is that what you were worried about? It's like, on slide 15 of lecture 14.
Well, yeah, just because like,
what wacky thing did I say?
I'm trying to make like flashcards and then for some stuff, it's like this much text. I was like, do I need to know all of this stuff? So then it's just like rambling on from like questions from students and then like
Rambling?
so,
I'm offended, sir.
like questions
I would say highly specific and nuanced answers. Not rambling. No, I'm just giving you a time. Yeah, please. It's closed book. Yeah, you just do it in class. Honestly, like you'll have the whole, I think it's on the 24th, the day, is it the 24th? Okay, yeah, right after reading week. Sorry, I'm being gassed up because this class is twice a week, and I'm like, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Tuesday, Thursday. Okay, it's the 24th. You come in, you sit down. I give you the password to access the exam. The password itself is always an inside joke for some reason. I don't know why. And then, like, I think in my 100, it was Durkheim is my homeboy was the password for my exam. Because I'm an insane person and I love doing stuff like that. But yeah, you just come in, you write it, and then you go. And it's closed book, and I will walk around the back row like a predator stalking you, making you nervous, and we'll go from there. Yeah, Reg.
The short answer is also on Canvas, right?
Correct. Yeah, you just type it in, on Canvas on whatever device you want to use. Nope, no pencils. What are pencils? Is it kind of like this, but for paper? I don't know. Yeah, please.
How long do we have for it?
The whole class. Yeah, so 80 minutes. There's nothing following us, so maybe I'll put it as 90 minutes, but it shouldn't take you that, honestly. Like, in other terms, I've had people write it in 50 minutes, and it's the same test, and everybody finishes, and it's all good. But I'm not gonna like time you out after 50 minutes and kick you out of class. Though that would be fun. Like, time's up, out. I want to go home. Good. Other questions about the exam? Nay. Okay. So, wow, I'm 6 minutes early. I thought I would be much earlier than that. Okay. Wednesday, and I'll send out an email to this, to this regard. I will be in my office. My office is Tory 1-062D, but it's, if you're looking for it, I'm in the center. My pen has died, apparently. Sadness abounds. Center for CCR. I'll just put CCR. Center for Criminological Research. First floor of Tory, kind of on the north side, or northeast side, I guess. If you can't find me, just email, but I will be around. Or call Reg. She hangs out there a lot of the time too. So, yeah, come on by if you have questions about the exam, about your major lab, or any kind of extra feedback you want. Do stop by, and I will be there. Yeah, Sasha. What's that?
Are you the leftmost office or the center?
I would be, I guess, the leftmost office, yeah. So I'm the one at the very end of the wall, by the tables, closest to the coffee machine, always, which is all I've had today. It's just pure coffee. So I'm now fueled by coffee and 0 calories, which my wife will yell at me for later, but that's fine. All right, you may go. I have no more to say than that. And you have hang on. I'm going to turn off my 17 microphones. Microphone 1. That one's yours. Microphone 2. Microphone 3. Yeah, have a good one. Okay, come. That's fine. I'm good.